5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong takes one small step onto the lunar surface. It's a moment etched into history, the culmination of a monumental effort.
I can't say that I would choose to spend a couple of weeks like that, but I'm very glad that we get the opportunity to complete the mission.
Between 1969 and 1972, 12 astronauts walked on the moon across 6 Apollo missions. Then silence. Eugene Cernan, the last man on the moon, stepped back into the lunar module in December 1972. Over 50 years later, despite incredible technological leaps, humanity hasn't returned. Why? Why did NASA, after achieving the seemingly impossible, stop going back to the moon? The answer isn't simple. It's a complex mix of money, politics, shifting goals, and calculated risks. Let's unravel it. To understand why we stopped going, we first need to grasp what it took to get there in the first place. The Apollo program wasn't just ambitious, it was staggeringly, almost unimaginably expensive and complex. Forget your typical government project budget overruns. This was on another scale entirely. At its peak, NASA's budget consumed nearly 4.5% of the entire US federal budget. Think about that. Almost 5 cents out of every single tax dollar was going towards putting astronauts on the moon. Adjusted for inflation, the total cost of the Apollo program is estimated to be somewhere north of $280 billion in today's money. Some estimates push it even higher. This wasn't just about building a few big rockets, though the Saturn V remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. It involved mobilizing an army of personnel, and over 400,000 engineers, scientists, technicians, and support staff worked on the project. It required inventing entirely new technologies, from advanced computing systems. The Apollo guidance computer had less processing power than your smartphone, yet landed men on the moon, to materials science breakthroughs needed for spacecraft construction and spacesuits. Entire industries were practically conjured into existence to meet the demands. Every single component, down to the smallest switch, had to be designed, tested, retested, and often redesigned for unprecedented reliability. There was no off-the-shelf solution for landing on another world. The sheer logistical challenge of coordinating hundreds of contractors across the country was itself a monumental feat of management. Apollo was, in essence, a wartime-level effort undertaken during peacetime, driven by a singular, clear goal fueled by intense geopolitical pressure. It was magnificent, yes, but financially and resource-wise, it was utterly extraordinary and perhaps unsustainable in the long run without that initial, powerful catalyst. But the eye-watering cost wasn't the only factor pulling NASA's focus away from the moon. Something else, fundamental, had changed back here on Earth. Let's be blunt, Apollo wasn't solely about science or exploration, it was fundamentally a product of the Cold War. President John F. Kennedy's 1961 challenge to land a man on the moon before the decade was out wasn't just aspirational, it was a direct response to the Soviet Union's early successes in space, Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin's first orbital flight. The space race became a proxy battleground, a high-stakes contest for technological and ideological supremacy. Landing on the moon first was seen as a definitive statement of American capability and superiority. The flag planted by Armstrong wasn't just a marker, it was a symbol of victory in that specific race. And once Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted that flag in 1969, the primary political objective was achieved. The United States had demonstrably beaten the Soviets to the moon, while subsequent Apollo missions conducted invaluable scientific research, gathering rocks, deploying experiments, and expanding our understanding of the moon's geology and history. The core political impetus began to fade rapidly. For many politicians and a growing segment of the public, the main event was over. We'd won. Public interest, initially sky-high, also started to wane after the first landing. Apollo 11 was a global phenomenon. Subsequent missions, while still incredible achievements, didn't capture the public imagination in quite the same way. television ratings dropped, people started asking harder questions about the immense cost, especially as pressing issues mounted back home. The Vietnam War was escalating, demanding huge resources and attention. Social programs addressing poverty and civil rights were gaining prominence and requiring significant funding. The argument became, why spend billions more going back to the moon when there are urgent problems right here on Earth? The political will to maintain Apollo-level funding evaporated almost as quickly as it had materialized. The sense of national urgency dissolved. The moon race was over and the political landscape had decisively shifted away from lunar exploration as a top priority. It wasn't just that politicians lost interest, their constituents were increasingly demanding they focus elsewhere. With the political drive gone and public attention drifting, the harsh realities of funding kicked in hard, forcing NASA to make some tough choices. Winning the space race came at a premium, and once the checkered flag was waved, the bill came due in a less forgiving economic climate. The peak funding levels of the mid-1960s were simply unsustainable without the Cold War imperative. As mentioned, nearly 4.5% of the federal budget went to NASA at Apollo's height. By the early 1970s, that percentage began a steep decline, eventually settling to less than 1% for most of the following decades, and often hovering closer to 0.5%. This wasn't just a small trim, it was a fundamental reordering of national priorities reflected in budget allocations. The economic context of the late 1960s and 1970s was crucial. The Vietnam War was not only a political quagmire, but also an enormous financial drain. Simultaneously, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiatives aimed at tackling poverty and inequality required substantial investment. Faced with these competing demands, funding a costly war, investing in domestic programs, and exploring space, something had to give. With the primary goal of the moon landing achieved, the massive budget for continued lunar missions became an easier target for cuts compared to the perceived necessities of war efforts or social spending. NASA itself had to adapt to this new fiscal reality. The last 3 planned Apollo missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, were cancelled primarily due to these budget cuts. The hardware, including Saturn V rockets, already existed or was in production, but the operational costs and the lack of political will sealed their fate. NASA needed to figure out how to continue space exploration within a much tighter budget. This meant looking for programs that offered, or at least promised, more perceived value or utility for the money, or were simply less expensive than repeated trips to the moon using the Apollo architecture. The focus shifted from singular, spectacular achievements like lunar landings towards developing reusable infrastructure and conducting research closer to home. The Apollo program, designed for one specific, expensive goal, didn't fit neatly into this new era of constrained budgets and shifting national focus. The sheer cost per mission of the Saturn V Apollo system, justifiable during the race, looked exorbitant when weighed against other pressing national needs and NASA's drastically reduced slice of the federal pie. Economics, pure and simple, played a massive role in keeping boots off the moon. This budget crunch didn't just mean cutting back, it also forced NASA to fundamentally rethink where it should focus its limited resources in space. With the moon receding as a destination due to cost and shifting politics, NASA's focus pivoted dramatically towards activities closer to Earth and exploration conducted by machines. This wasn't necessarily a step backward, but a strategic redirection of resources towards different, arguably more sustainable goals within the new budget constraints. The most prominent example of this shift was the Space Shuttle program. Conceived in the post-Apollo era, the shuttle promised routine, reusable access to low Earth orbit, LEO. The dream was an affordable space truck that could deploy satellites, conduct experiments in microgravity, and potentially service spacecraft. While the shuttle never achieved the low costs initially projected and tragically proved the dangers of complex reusable systems, it consumed the lion's share of NASA's human spaceflight budget and attention for 3 decades. Building and operating the shuttle fleet and later its primary payload, the International Space Station, ISS, became NASA's main human spaceflight endeavor. LEO became the human frontier. Alongside the Shuttle Skylab, America's first space station launched in 1973 using repurposed Apollo hardware, a Saturn V third stage, provided an early glimpse into long-duration human missions in orbit. It demonstrated that astronauts could live and work in space for extended periods, conducting valuable scientific research in fields like solar astronomy, Earth observation, and human physiology. Though relatively short-lived compared to the ISS, Skylab marked a clear pivot towards utilizing the space environment near Earth rather than venturing further out. Furthermore, this era saw a golden age of robotic exploration. While human missions were largely confined to LEO, uncrewed probes ventured throughout the solar system, delivering incredible scientific returns for a fraction of the cost of human missions. The Viking landers touched down on Mars in 1976, searching for signs of life. The Voyager probes embarked on their grand tour of the outer planets, providing breathtaking images and data from Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and they're still sending back data from interstellar space. Missions like Pioneer, Mariner, and later Galileo, Magellan, Cassini-Huygens, and the Mars rovers continue to expand our knowledge of the cosmos. These robotic explorers offered a compelling alternative: vast scientific discovery without the immense cost, complexity, and inherent risk of sending humans deep into space. For many scientists and policymakers, the scientific bang for the buck from robotic missions was simply undeniable, making them an attractive investment compared to the monumental expense of returning humans to the moon. The focus shifted from planting flags to gathering data across the entire solar system, largely via our robotic emissaries. And speaking of risk, the memory of close calls and the reality of spaceflight dangers also played a subtle but significant role in the decisions made after Apollo. Spaceflight is inherently dangerous. The Apollo program, despite its successes, operated right on the edge of technological capability and human endurance. Every mission involved launching humans atop millions of pounds of high explosives, sending them 250,000 miles from Earth, keeping them alive in a vacuum, and bringing them back safely through a fiery atmospheric re-entry. The success of Apollo was a testament to incredible engineering and rigorous procedures, but the risks were astronomical. The near disaster of Apollo 13 in 1970 brought these dangers into sharp focus for the entire world. An oxygen tank explosion crippled the spacecraft halfway to the moon, forcing the crew and mission control into a desperate, ingenious fight for survival. While ultimately a story of incredible recovery, a successful failure as it's often called, Apollo 13 served as a stark reminder of how quickly things could go catastrophically wrong so far from home. It underscored the vulnerability of astronauts in deep space and the razor-thin margins for error. It's possible this brush with tragedy subtly eroded some of the remaining public and political appetite for the risks involved in lunar missions, especially after the main goal of landing had been achieved. Moreover, the legacy of Apollo wasn't just the successes. The tragic Apollo 1 fire in 1967, which killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test, had already forced a major redesign and overhaul of the command module and safety procedures. While this ultimately made the spacecraft safer for the lunar missions, it was a horrific reminder of the potential cost. Later, the Challenger disaster in 1986 and the Columbia disaster in 2003, both involving the space shuttle in low Earth orbit, further reinforced the inherent dangers of human spaceflight even closer to home. Each tragedy led to intense scrutiny, investigations, and changes in safety culture and procedures. While these incidents didn't directly involve lunar missions, they contributed to a broader climate of risk awareness within NASA and among policymakers. Sending humans back to the moon, a vastly more complex and distant undertaking than LEO missions, would require accepting enormous risks. In the absence of a compelling Cold War-style imperative, the willingness to accept those risks, both politically and perhaps institutionally, was arguably lower than it had been during the Apollo era. Safety considerations informed by past close calls and tragedies became an increasingly significant factor in planning any future human deep space endeavors. Beyond the risks and costs, there was another fundamental question. If we did go back right after Apollo, what exactly would we do there? And did we even have the right tools for a longer stay? The Apollo architecture, brilliant as it was for its specific purpose, was fundamentally designed for short sorties to the lunar surface. Land, explore briefly nearby, plant a flag, collect some rocks, and come home. It was an incredible achievement in exploration, but it wasn't built for establishing any kind of sustainable presence or conducting long-term, complex scientific operations on the Moon. The lunar module, LM, could only support 2 astronauts for a maximum of about 3 days on the surface. The life support system's power supplies and living space were minimal, designed for these quick flags and footprints missions. The Saturn V rocket, while immensely powerful, was an expendable, single-use vehicle, making each launch incredibly expensive. Returning to the Moon in a meaningful way after Apollo would require more than just repeating the same missions. What would be the purpose? Simply planting more flags or collecting more rocks, while scientifically useful, lacked the compelling political or public draw of the initial landings. To justify the immense cost and risk of returning, new goals were needed. Would we build a permanent base, conduct extensive geological surveys across vast areas, utilize lunar resources, perform astronomical observations from the lunar surface? These ambitions required capabilities far beyond what the Apollo hardware could offer. New technologies would be essential: reusable landers, long-term habitats, closed-loop life support systems to minimize reliance on supplies from Earth, advanced power generation like nuclear power, sources suitable for the long lunar night, more capable rovers for extended exploration, and potentially methods for utilizing local resources like extracting water ice from permanently shadowed craters. Developing these technologies would require significant time, investment, and research, resources that were largely directed towards the space shuttle and LEO activities in the decades following Apollo. Essentially, NASA faced a choice: keep using the expensive, limited Apollo system for diminishing scientific and political returns, or pause lunar missions until new technologies and clearer long-term objectives could be developed. Given the budget constraints and shifting priorities already discussed, the latter path was effectively chosen. There was a recognition that simply repeating Apollo wasn't enough, and the leap needed for a sustained lunar presence, building infrastructure, enabling longer stays, perhaps even resource utilization, required a technological evolution that hadn't yet happened and wasn't being actively funded for the Moon. The focus shifted to developing enabling technologies in LEO like those for the ISS, with the idea that they might eventually support deeper space exploration, but a direct, continuous path back to the Moon was put on hold. This lack of a clear, funded, long-term strategy for lunar return also meant that any attempts to restart Moon programs often got caught in political crosswinds. Even though NASA didn't return to the Moon for decades, the idea never completely vanished. However, attempts to initiate a return have been repeatedly hampered by shifting political winds and inconsistent funding, creating a frustrating cycle of starting, stopping, and restarting programs. Each new presidential administration often brings its own vision for space exploration, leading to changes in direction that prevent long-term strategies from taking root. In 1989, on the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative, SEI, which called for returning to the Moon to stay and then journeying onward to Mars. It was an ambitious vision, but it lacked strong congressional support and a realistic funding plan. A NASA study estimated the cost could reach $400 to $500 billion over several decades, a figure that proved politically unpalatable, and the initiative quietly faded away. Fast forward to 2004, following the Columbia disaster, President George W. Bush announced the vision for space exploration, which again aimed for a return to the Moon by 2020 as a stepping stone for Mars missions. This led to the Constellation program, which began developing new rockets, Ares-1 and Ares-5, and the Orion crew capsule. Unlike SEI, Constellation received initial funding and made some progress. However, it faced criticism for being underfunded, behind schedule, and reliant on technologies that were proving difficult and expensive to develop. Then came another shift. In 2010, President Barack Obama's administration canceled the Constellation program, citing it as unsustainable. the focus shifted towards developing commercial crew capabilities to service the ISS, investing in new technologies for deep space exploration, and setting a more flexible, long-term goal of sending astronauts to an asteroid, later refined, and eventually Mars, bypassing a dedicated lunar return program initially. The Space Launch System, SLS rocket, and the Orion capsule development continued, but the specific lunar landing architecture from Constellation was scrapped. More recently, President Donald Trump's administration redirected NASA's focus squarely back to the Moon with the Artemis program, announced in 2017 and accelerated in 2019 with the ambitious goal of landing the first woman and next man on the Moon by 2024, a timeline later acknowledged as unrealistic. Artemis aims for a sustainable lunar presence involving commercial partners and international collaboration explicitly as preparation for future Mars missions. The Biden administration has continued support for Artemis, though timelines continue to be adjusted based on budgets and technical progress. This constant back and forth, announcing grand visions, starting programs, then canceling or redirecting them under subsequent administrations, makes it incredibly difficult to execute complex multi-decade projects like returning humans to the Moon. Consistent, long-term political and financial commitment is crucial, and that has often been lacking in the half-century since Apollo 17. So why did NASA never return to the Moon after 1972? As we've seen, there's no single smoking gun. It was a confluence of factors: the astronomical cost of the Apollo program, the achievement of the primary Cold War political goal, dwindling public interest, shifting national priorities towards domestic issues and wars, the rise of more affordable robotic exploration, the allure and budget demands of the Space Shuttle and ISS in low Earth orbit, the inherent risks of deep space travel, the need for new technologies beyond the Apollo architecture, and decades of inconsistent political vision and funding. Apollo was a unique alignment of political will, national resources, and technological ambition focused on a singular, monumental goal. Recreating that perfect storm has proven difficult. But now, 50 years later, the Moon is firmly back in NASA's sights with the Artemis program, aiming not just for footprints, but for a sustained presence, leveraging new technologies and international partnerships. Will this time be different? Will the political will and funding remain steady enough to finally end the long hiatus? Only time will tell.